Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 3. An interesting title for you, From Crap to Sift. I'll explain that in just a minute. To explain that, we'll recap a little bit of the first two lessons. So as I mentioned, English 201 takes what you learned in English 101 and builds upon it. Now, not everyone in this course took English 101 from me. Not even everyone in the course probably took English 101 at EWU. You may have taken it at your high school, at a community college, at another university. So we really need to spend the first few lessons thoroughly reviewing the most fundamental concepts in English 101. So far we've reviewed rhetoric in Lesson 1, critical reading in Lesson 2. The goal of the class, both 101 and 201, is to hone your communication skills so that you can communicate effectively in all different types of situations. Rhetoric from Lesson 1 is the study of communication, how it works, how we persuade people, and also being able to be persuasive yourself. So that's a pretty natural fit with our course goal. The second thing we reviewed in detail from Lesson 2, critical reading, is, as it sounds, learning how to read, thoroughly analyze, deeply. Studies show that learning to read critically and deeply helps one improve in their writing, and learning to write well helps one read more challenging and demanding things with greater ease. So, critical reading is an invaluable part. Its value cannot be overstated to rhetoric. Seeing how others use rhetorical strategies to persuade helps us grow in our own use of rhetoric. So critical reading is very important as well. The third thing we're going to review, kind of building on critical reading as another important part of rhetoric, is analyzing the credibility, authority, reliability of the information you see. So on one level, critical reading is understanding and analyzing, commenting on the message of a text. The next level here with credibility analysis is, can I trust this information that I've critically read to be true or not? So hopefully you can see there how that's a third very important step in understanding rhetoric and learning to use rhetoric well. In 101, we use something in my class called the CRAP test, which stands for credibility, reliability, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So 5 things to look for in a piece of information when you are hoping that that piece of information can present trustworthy and reliable information. So ironically, if something passes the CRAP test and it is indeed crap, it has all 5 of those things, it's a very trustworthy, reliable source. We're only going to spend 2 slides reviewing crap. Then we're going to shift to sift. Sift is an entirely new thing I'm introducing in 201, but it really builds on the crap test. It's actually a way of making the crap test more useful. It's a way of applying the crap test in a very specific way. And as I mentioned before, one of the ways I really want to build on what you learned in 101 but go further is to add in this element of media literacy, which is where you look at the media you encounter and you ask, is this trustworthy? Is this reliable? Harkening back to Spider-Man Far From Home, we live in an age of fake news where people are just making things up and presenting it in a way that makes it look as if it were very true, and doing all kinds of problematic things when doing that, such as completely defaming someone's character, like you saw in Spider-Man Far From Home. So we have to apply the crap test to what we read, but we also have to sift through what we read before we even get to the place of applying the crap test, saying, is this even worth reading, and trying to see if it's credible. So we'll review crap, we'll study sift in some detail with some examples, and then you'll have both at your disposal to analyze all of the things you encounter. So we'll start with the review of the crap test. There's the ironic poop emoji. Usually you don't want something to be crap. In this case, you do. Adding a little bit of humor, I think, helps tremendously in terms of trying to remember something. Like 5-letter acronym. So credibility, reliability, authority, accuracy, purpose. How can you do these things? We'll talk in much more detail when we get into the specifics of SIFT, because the things you do when you're sifting through stuff are actually ways of checking to see if it's crap, to see if it's reliable and credible. But just real briefly, looking at, say, an article you're reading online, who is the author? You can use the internet to research the author. Who is the publisher? You can research the publisher. Are they biased? What other things has the author written? Do they have credentials? Do they have degrees? Are those degrees in the specific field, the subject you're reading about? That also speaks to authority. Accuracy, you can look for the same information in other places to see if other places are reporting the same information. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, purpose. What is the purpose, the goal of the thing you're reading? And here we have a direct connect to rhetorical analysis, right? Because when you read a piece for its rhetoric, you say, what is the author trying to achieve? They might have, a real agenda there that skews the information a certain way and makes it less accurate. Now, there can be a time and a place for reading things that have bias, and I'll explain that in a little bit. It's not that things with bias are completely unuseful, but in this lecture, I'm focusing particularly on things that report to be news, that claim to be presenting you with truth. And no matter what we're reading, if it has a bias, even if that bias is useful to our own purposes and why we're reading it, we need to be aware of it. So we need to apply the CRAP and the SIFT tests. And like I said, the irony of the poop emoji, it should be CRAP. It should have these 5 things. Hopefully that helps you remember it better. Okay, so moving from that quick review of CRAP to SIFT, what is SIFT and how can it help us discern the credibility, the reliability, the accuracy of something? The first letter is stop. So when you feel strong emotion, surprise, or just an irresistible urge, stop. Then use your other moves. And the other moves, the other 3 things. I want to mention this first because we read lots of things. And when we're evaluating the credibility of something, emotion, in terms of our rhetorical appeals, emotion, logic, character, it seems like character and logic, timeliness, when was it published, would be more important than emotion. But emotion can be a good early indicator. All 4 of the rhetorical appeals are useful in this process because maybe it makes you feel something, and maybe that feeling gives you just enough pause to stop reading it and sift. So that's just one example with emotion there. But the idea here is the most important probably letter in SIFT is the S, because that's what it gets you to do, is to stop reading and make other moves before you read it. Because we can spend a lot of time reading things, and we only have so much time in the day, and sometimes we can really go down some rabbit holes. I know I've really gotten lost, caught up reading things before that ultimately weren't useful. So that's an important step here, is to stop and then do the other 3 things. But what are the other 3 things? Investigate the source, find better coverage, trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. So we're going to discuss each of these 3 things on the subsequent slides. I want you to have an overview first. But basically, you start to read something in it gives you pause. So you stop and you say, maybe I better investigate this first. So look at what you're reading, start to analyze the author, the publisher, then find better coverage. Look for other sources reporting the same information and see if they're reporting on the same topic in the same way and there's multiple reports. That's a good sign it's trustworthy. Finally, look at what they say, investigate those arguments, look at the quotes, where they come from. If there's any pictures or other media, videos, hyperlinks, investigate those as well. Trace those back to the source. Because people will pull quotes and images out of context all the time and change their meaning by where they place them in their own document. So stop reading, investigate these other things. And then you'll know these steps. So maybe you're reading something that takes half an hour to read. These steps may only take you 10 minutes. Then you may decide, I don't need to read this, and can move on to the next thing. So it might seem like a lot of work, but can actually save you time in the long run, and it can prevent you from reading something that's fake and trying to manipulate you. Let's look at each of these in more detail. Investigate the source. Now, if you read the SIFT reading that I assigned, you'll see that it was a website with hyperlinks to different parts of it, not a traditional article. So hopefully you clicked on those hyperlinks and read the different things. I'm going to cover them in some detail now, but not great detail. So if you haven't, be sure to read them yourself, because each of these tools will be really useful not only in this class, but in other classes you take, and anytime you're reading media that you feel may not be trustworthy, which is, I would hazard to guess, a pretty common occurrence in our current culture. So after you stop and you try to do other things, the first step is investigate the source. What does that involve? Hover over hyperlinks every time, not just when you are suspicious. So I've asked you to read a few things for this class. Some of those are what I call web articles. Even the student sample paper you looked at in the last lesson was written as a web article and had hyperlinks. So anytime you're reading a document or an article or a social media post, anything that has hyperlinks, move your cursor over the hyperlink. It'll usually tell you where it's from. Moreover, you can click on the hyperlink and investigate the source. So, for instance, if you had done this with the student sample I gave you last time, maybe for some reason you suspected that of being fake news, you could click on that author's hyperlinks, go to those sources. You would have found that the sources were all credible, but it gave you the opportunity to at least investigate them. And if you're reading something online, usually you can move your cursor, that's what he means by hover, over the hyperlink, and it'll just tell you where it's from. And if you've heard of the source, that might be enough information. So he says, hover over the hyperlinks every time, not just when you are suspicious, because it only takes a few seconds. And as much as we like to think we're going to be vigilant and on guard, authors, creators of media in our culture today have all kinds of special tools at their disposal because of the recent advancements in technology, and they can easily manipulate things and make them look very, very reliable. So there's no harm in taking a few seconds and just hovering over the hyperlinks to see what they are, because you may be tricked without even knowing it. And I would say that that's true for other steps on here, like the first step, stop. With anything you're reading that seems important, even if it seems trustworthy, I would say just stop. And you don't have to do all of these steps, but do one or two of them or a few of them, just enough, to verify that this seems reliable. Even when you don't seem worried about it, that stop step is really important, because there's so much further research we can do that will not only save us time, but protect us in a world of misinformation. Most English news sources, English language news sources, have Wikipedia pages. So if you're reading an online article, it was published by some journal, and you can click on, or well, you'd probably have to type it in, but you could type in the name of that journal on Wikipedia, and its page would come up. Even some of the most obscure things have their own Wikipedia pages. Now, is Wikipedia a reliable source? We'll talk about that more later in the lecture, but just the fact it has a Wikipedia page means it's a news source that's been around for at least a little while, and that in itself gives it some credibility. But if it has a bias, or it's a fake news site, some fake news sites are well known enough now, it'll tell you on Wikipedia that it's a fake news site. You can gather a little bit of basic info about a Wikipedia page, and if it's a news outlet, the Wikipedia page will at least tell you if it's like a real news outlet that's been around for a while, even just by having a Wikipedia page. So he uses two examples of more reliable news sources, Reuters and Vox. Now, I say more reliable because neither of these is perfectly reliable. Reuters is pretty reliable, and we'll look at it in part 2 of the lecture, a specific example from Reuters. because it's a world news source that's been around a long time. It follows certain trust principles, and it has long specialized in being objective. It's sort of known for its objectivity. Now, that's not always true. It's not always possible to maintain complete objectivity, even if that's the goal. But it at least strives for it. Vox is the example he actually uses on the Wikipedia section of his website. If you looked at that, and it's a good example because Vox says right on its Wikipedia page. If you just Wikipedia Vox, I recommend you do it. You can even pause the lecture and do it. But at some point, Wikipedia Vox, it says it's a left-leaning news source. Now, it's a news source that's been around a long time. Most of their reporters are experts in their field. So those are good signs of credibility and reliability. But it's left-leaning, which means inherent bias. And I'm very wary of anything that, especially if I'm looking for news, anything that is left-leaning or right-leaning, because that means there's going to be some bias. So we're not going to read things from Vox assuming them to be objective. But that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. I like reading things on Vox, even though I don't really like that bias when it comes up, because they have really good analysis of film. Like they have some good articles on Spider-Man Far From Home. I thought about assigning you. So that's an example of when it can be useful. Analysis of media, because that's an analytical piece, not a news piece. Even the example he uses is fairly reliable, even though it's a news piece, because it was just reporting something pretty basic early on in the pandemic, and the person who wrote it was an expert in that field. Now, you certainly wouldn't be able to trust every piece of news you read on Vox, but contextually, I think that one was reliable. The example he uses on the site. If you read the site as part of your reading for the lesson, you know what I mean. So a lot of this comes down to context. There will be some sources that are reliable most of the time, like Reuters, but probably not any source that's reliable 100% of the time. Then there'll be sources that are reliable some of the time for some things, but certainly not all things. And then there'll be sources that are just outright fake and made up. So there's kind of a spectrum here that's important to know. So here we start to see the connection between SIFT and CRAP. So as you investigate the source, use the CRAP test. So you take SIFT really first. We learned CRAP in 101 because it's a more basic, more fundamental skill set. SIFT is a little more complex, but you really would use SIFT first because you would stop, investigate the source. Then when you investigate the source, you would look up the author, the publisher, like we just did with Vox. So you hover over the author's hyperlinks. Is the author credible? Check out the publisher's Wikipedia page. Is the publisher credible? Just a couple of examples there. Hopefully the connection between SIFT and CRAP is clear here. Let's now move on to the F in SIFT, find better. This is really important because if you're talking about news in particular, a news source may be reporting a special, big, important event, something major just occurred. If you can find other sources that report it, then it's probably reliable. You can also look at those sources to see if they're reporting the way it happened, if they're saying it happened the same way as the thing you're reading. So if they're covering it, other news sources, say you're reading about a major event, something happened, a big deal. Is this true, how it happened, and what you're reading? If other news sources report that it probably is. If they're reporting it the same way, it probably is. If they're saying it happened differently, then you have to dig further. So basically try to verify the story through multiple news outlets. You can also find the original source. So if the thing you're reading says the information comes from this place, go to that place, because sometimes they're saying this event happened and it happened this way. And then here's where my information comes from. Click that and you'll see, no, they're saying it happened a very different way. So look for it in other places. Look to see if those places are describing it the same way. and then look at the original source and see if it matches. If no one else is reporting it, that's probably cause for alarm. Maybe this didn't even actually happen. And when you go to that original source, you can apply the crap test, because maybe the original source and the source you're reading match, but maybe the original source is bogus. So definitely apply the crap test throughout this process. And a really important thing here is we care about the claim, the argument the source is making. So that's what we're interested in. And as we care about the claim, an important thing to remember is we're not experts. So one thing I'm teaching you quite a bit in this class is logical reasoning. The logos, the most important of the rhetorical appeals. So you can read a claim and you can think about, does this make sense? But if you're reading about something in the medical field and you're not a doctor, can you really debate the plausibility of the claim? Well, no. But you can go find other doctors, other articles written by doctors, and see what they say. And so it's great to a certain extent to rely on our own logical reasoning. But when we're investigating claims, we have to acknowledge that there are limits to our own logical reasoning to a degree. But there are other very reliable sources out there we can trust. The point of this, like to sum sift up in one sentence, is to look for other sources besides just the one source you're reading. Because one source can be very persuasive, look really good, really suck you in, and not only can you waste time, but you can maybe start to believe things that aren't true. Finally, the last one is trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. This seems kind of obvious, and we really talked about it already with the crap test, but he goes into specific detail on this part of his website and talks about something called framing, which is really important. So I want to show that to you here. His first advice here is to check the date. You might find a news article that's completely accurate, but they're reporting it in 2022, and it happened in 2009 or 2012. He actually has an example like that on his site. So this is true, but old. So why are they using something old? To make you think it's happening now, or to trick you or manipulate you in some way. So check the date first. His second piece of advice on this part of the site is to click through and find. So go through the article and just skim it. Don't read anything, but just click the hyperlinks, click the pictures, trace all those sources, click the quotes. Each quote should have a hyperlink of where it came from, and if it doesn't, that's an alarming sign. But the main reason he says click through and find is this thing I mentioned a couple minutes ago, framing. So there's all kinds of fake news and conspiracy theory sites out there that aren't real, aren't true. And a lot of them you can tell that pretty easily, but some of them do an incredibly good job of appearing to be true. And one of the techniques they use is framing. So what is framing? How can we avoid it? Well, clicking through and finding is the way we avoid it. But what does that look like? So he has an example of a social media post that says this doctor at some major university was arrested. And if you click on the link in it, it links to CNN. Now, I want to be really clear here. I personally do not think CNN is a reliable news source. Much of what they report is probably true, but they are very, very biased. Nonetheless, they're a major news source that many people see as accurate. So just by including a link to CNN in this post, the author of the post gives his post an immediate sense of credibility for many readers. But if you click on the link and go to the original CNN article, you will see that it's very, very different. And he searched for key terms. So this CNN article shows that this doctor was actually indeed arrested, and he did indeed have ties to China, but it was for completely different reasons than the social media poster claimed. It had nothing to do with the coronavirus. It had to do with some kind of economic fraud or something, if my memory serves me right. So The key terms were like doctor, the name of the school, China, and coronavirus. So those first three terms all came up, but coronavirus didn't come up. So you can see how the author of the media post used an article from CNN to make up something completely fake, linked that article, gave it some ethos for readers who like CNN, which is a lot of people. He gave his social media some posts, some ethos, some credibility just by linking to CNN, even though it was completely made up what he was saying. And anyone who read that but did not click on the link to CNN and read the original article would probably be completely duped. So this is why when you get something you're reading, before you read it, click through the hyperlinks, click through the pictures, and see, if it's reliable or not. See if the source material they're using is reliable, and see if it matches. Like I said, it turns out the original article was about something else entirely. So before we move on from SIFT, I want to sum up. You're reading something. Almost anything applies some of these steps, but if what you're reading seems dubious or you just get a troubled feeling, stop, look at the original sources, apply the CRAP test to those original sources and see if they're credible and reliable. See if the content of this thing you're reading matches the original sources, and then read it. You can also see if other news outlets are reporting the same information. And so you weave SIFT and CRAP together, and you can very easily assess if something is fake news. Now we're going to go through a specific example of what I just talked about to illustrate it. Couple of quick things before we do that. One, I have not divided this lecture into two parts. This example is going to be really quick and brief. And usually I divide the lecture into two parts when the total time of the lecture is pretty long. This will be longer than any individual part, but if it were separated out, they'd be very short. So please continue on in the lecture. But second thing I wanted to say is I've got this picture here from the article I put up, Fake News Has Always Been Spider-Man's Greatest Foe. And I thought you would enjoy this piece. I'm not really going to discuss it in the lecture because it's pretty straightforward. But after watching Spider-Man Far From Home, I thought you would enjoy reading it and seeing how this issue of fake news has existed much longer than the phrase, fake news has been around, because people have really been trying to manipulate other people since the beginning of time. And Spider-Man has been the superhero who always had a bad rap in the news. People were always making things up about him and painting him as a villain, even though he was really a hero. So I think Spider-Man, as we study media literacy and try to battle fake news in this class, I think Spider-Man is just a great example to show how this topic is important, relatable, and really been around a long time. Finally, the third thing I'll say before we start with part two is in the discussion board post, I have asked you to do a fake news analysis. So basically, find an article, any article you want. I don't care what it is. You can use whatever you want online and do the kind of analysis I'm about to demonstrate here and come to the conclusion of whether this is credible and reliable or whether it's maybe made up or just not very credible, not very reliable, and explain why, obviously. But I think this topic of media literacy is so very important and so foundational to what we do in English 101 and 201, because we use research to prove arguments in these classes, that your first major paper that's due in a few weeks is actually a fake news analysis. So this is practice for it. We'll have even more practice with it and for it in the next lesson. And you can even use your discussion board post from this assignment as like a starting point for your paper. Parts of it can be incorporated into your paper, and I'll explain more of that in the next lecture and on Canvas, on the assignment prompts on Canvas. But just be thinking about that when you choose your text, your article, for this fake news mini analysis for the discussion board post. Think about you're going to be doing a full-length fake news analysis for the first paper, and this can be a starting point for you. So do a good job of it for those reasons. All right, but let's see an example of using CRAP and SIFT to assess whether something is fake news. So I gave you two articles. One was from NPR, and the second was from Reuters, which we talked about in the previous part of the lecture. And basically, NPR seems like it would be a reliable source, and I think much of the time it is. But this Reuters article shows how the NPR article actually reported fake news. So by sifting, by not just reading the NPR article, but also reading something else, I was able to find that this NPR article actually reported something false. It wasn't true. So the question we're asking, is this an example of fake news? That's the question you'll answer in your discussion board post and in your first paper. I did a little bit of research on NPR. So if you go to the Wikipedia page, it actually says they've been known for both liberal biases and conservative biases at different points over the years, even though they're supposed to be or claim to be a very objective news institution. My personal experience of interacting with NPR, I think they have more of a liberal bias, especially recently. In this article has an incredible liberal bias. So this is a good example of looking at every piece you read contextually on a case-by-case basis. Like how I said in part one, sometimes Vox can be useful, but not in all situations. NPR is probably reliable much of the time. And some of the time, it is actually liberally biased, and some of the time it's actually conservatively biased. This particular article, just by reading a few paragraphs, you can tell it's very liberal biased. So NPR can be great in different contexts, and even when it's unreliable in different ways. So it's not something we can say is always reliable. It's certainly not as reliable as Reuters, but it's also not just fake news site. This is one particular instance of fake news. And so as you read, you need to be aware of that. And looking for bias is a great way to just do crap and sift really minimally as you read. As you're reading it, does this author, just their tone, the statements they're saying, do they seem pretty objective, or are they showing some bias? And we'll see examples in a minute. But the quote from the article, their claim, remember we're investigating the claim, their argument. So their argument is that the Supreme Court justices earlier this week, they claimed that the head judge, the person who's leads them, asked all the judges to wear masks because one of the judges, Sotomayor, has diabetes and is high risk for COVID-19, and with the Omicron variant, there's been more outbreaks. And then they claim that when Roberts, the head judge, asked all the judges to do this, Gorsuch, one of the judges, did not mask up. And Sotomayor, who sits next to him and is high risk, went and teleworked from her chambers. So this is the claim. Did this actually happen? At this point, I want to stop and sift and see if this really happened or not. But even as I read this article, I'm immediately alarmed because later it says Gorsuch, from the beginning of his tenure, has proved a prickly justice, not exactly beloved even by his conservative soulmates on the court. So as I read further and I apply the crap test, I think about the P, the purpose from the crap test, and I think the purpose seems more so, it's not just saying this happened, this incident described in the previous quote, it seems to be an attack on his character. This is just the first of several paragraphs devoted to really besmirching Gorsuch's character. And so as I read and I see that's the purpose, I immediately become suspect because that seems like a very biased, not objective purpose. And I say it's a liberal bias because he's a conservative judge and that's the one they're attacking. So when I think about this, I think about, why would someone do that? And the motive does not seem to be objective. So I don't know anything about Gorsuch. He could be a real bad dude. So it's not the fact that they're attacking him, it's the fact that they're attacking somebody, that the purpose of the article seems to be a type of purpose that is typically nefarious. So Gorsuch could be a really bad dude, and he could deserve this critique, but I don't know that without sifting. And the fact that this article has as its purpose an attack, that right there says, okay, to me that says I need to sift. So I sifted in what I found a different article from Reuters. From Wikipedia, I immediately know that Reuters has never been accused of the degree of bias that NPR has been accused of. And in just reading the Reuters article, it has a much more objective, less biased tone. Let's see some quotes that show that. So reporting that, so actually the first paragraph, I should say, says there's a report the next day after the NPR article came out. The two justices, Sotomayor and Gorsuch, got together and issued a report that just completely denied the NPR report. And in their report, they said that the NPR report surprised us. It is false because while we may disagree about the law, sometimes we are warm colleagues and friends. So the NPR article had an agenda of presenting and reporting discord between a liberal judge and a conservative judge on the Supreme Court. And these two judges are saying together in a joint statement they wrote together that even though they disagree often because they have different political biases, they're warm colleagues and friends. And so they basically refute the NPR report. So we know right there that basically it's false, but let's dig a little bit deeper and kind of suss that out more. There's another statement that completely refutes what's in the NPR report where Roberts, the head judge, he issued a separate statement saying he never even asked them to mask up. So there's two blatant statements from the NPR report that the justices themselves actually refuted just the next day. So we already know, just from the first 5 paragraphs of the Reuters article, that the NPR report was false. They made it up. But like I said, NPR is a very nationally recognized news institution that can often be very reliable. So I think this is worth sifting and applying the crap test a little further to see why. Why would they make this up? One thing that seems really key is the objectivity of the Reuters article. Because they say later below when they're talking about a specific detail, they say Reuters could not independently verify the accuracy of the reports. So they quote something so that readers have that information, but then they say they could not prove it. Right there, that shows credibility and objectivity. If I'm reading something and the author says that, I'm probably going to trust them because they show me that they're striving for objectivity. I also included for you in the reading the trust principles that Reuters follows. You don't need to read those. You could just glance at them. But the fact that they're trying to adhere to these specific trust principles shows some credibility. And then their Wikipedia page, to just kind of echo what I said earlier about investigating news sources by reading about them on Wikipedia. But you can just skim those. That's just kind of further evidence to show the credibility. Now, do I believe Reuters is always objective? No. But for the most part, it seems pretty reliable. If we're reading something on Reuters, the amount of sifting we'd have to do would probably be pretty small. But we should always be skeptical, always have that sift test in the back of our mind and be ready to deploy it. The article also refutes the character attack. They say a rift between Gorsuch and Sotomayor would have been at odds with their friendly relationship on the bench. Over the years, observers had noted the pair frequently laughing together. He's a lovely person, Sotomayor told an audience in 2019. So this here to me gets at what I was saying about digging deeper and seeing why would NPR make up that report. Well, you have a liberal and a conservative judge who clearly obviously disagree on some things, but are treat each other as human beings, as colleagues, and are able to work together effectively and efficiently for the purpose of serving the Supreme Court and thus serving the people of the U.S., our country. But so why would NPR try to tarnish the image of that positive working relationship between two people who politically are at odds, but able to work together in peace? Well, I would argue that there's more discord and disunity now than there has ever been between liberals and conservatives in the U.S. And in a class like this, politics comes up quite frequently because of the topics people choose to write on. And if I'm asking you to write about fake news and analyze media, politics is going to come up even more. So I want to make very, very clear from the get-go that in this class, the topic you write on is not what's important for me determining your grade. There are some topics that are not good choices, and we can talk about that later on. But if you take a certain stance, even if I personally disagree with your stance, that will not affect your grade. I want to be very clear about that, because in other classes, that can't actually be true, I'm ashamed to say. But in my class, that is not true. And what it'll come down to your grade is how well do you support and defend your topic? Do you use credible sources? Do you use logical reasoning? Do you make a persuasive disagreement? I may really disagree with your argument, potentially, hypothetically, but if you make a very convincing case for it and do a good job writing the paper, A+, A+. So I want to make that clear. And I want to make one other thing clear, is that in terms of liberal conservative views, both are welcome in this class. We need to discuss and analyze and share both. But I think if I'm going to make a bold statement, I'm going to say I think the biggest problem in our country right now is disunity. And the kind of article by NPR that sows disunity and creates disunity is part of the problem. I've lived long enough, I'm not that old, but I've lived long enough to see liberals and conservatives work together well for the greater good. And I've been very sad to see that change in my lifetime in more recent years. And so I wanted to give you this example before we enter into more political territory, to make those things I just mentioned clear. But hopefully it was a good example that shows you how to do a fake news analysis. And hopefully you can do a great job of that for your discussion board and learn some things that help you whenever you read media. I very much look forward to reading those discussion board posts. It is probably a different kind of assignment than you've had before, so please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, but I really look forward to reading the posts.